Wichita, Kansas. A calm, middle American city where families felt safe, where neighbors waved from freshly mowed lawns, and where the biggest worry was the next church bake sale. Among the smiling faces of this peaceful community lived a man who seemed to embody small-town respectability. His name was Dennis Rader. To everyone around him, Dennis was the kind of man you trusted instantly. He served as the president of his church council, organizing Sunday school activities and setting up chairs before service. He volunteered with the local Boy Scouts, teaching boys survival skills and the value of discipline. He even worked as a city compliance officer, the guy who checked that your grass wasn't too long, your trash bins weren't left on the street, and your pets were properly licensed. He was polite, firm, always neatly dressed. Neighbors described him as meticulous. His shirts were perfectly ironed, his tie always straight, his hair combed to a military shine. If Dennis gave you a handshake, you remembered how steady and controlled it felt. He kept careful notes on everything, from neighborhood ordinances to the exact time his children got home from school. But beneath the polished exterior, behind the church meetings and scout trips, lurked a darkness so calculating, so patient, that no one, not his wife, not his children, not his closest friends, could have imagined the nightmare waiting to be revealed. Dennis carried a secret obsession. He fantasized about power, control. He dreamed of binding his victims, torturing them, and finally killing them. 3 words captured his twisted mission: bind, torture, kill. Words he would later sign like a calling card, a signature that would terrorize Wichita for decades. For years, Dennis Rader lived this double life: family man by day, predator by night. And on the cold morning of January 15, 1974, his hidden world finally broke through the surface. Inside a modest family home, a young mother, a devoted father, and their 2 innocent children would cross paths with a monster whose name no one yet knew. Their tragedy would shake an entire city. It would introduce Wichita to a killer who craved not just murder, but recognition. A killer who would toy with detectives, mock the media, and vanish like a ghost, only to return decades later. This is the story of BTK, and the nightmare begins with the Otero family. Part 2, The Otero Family Massacre, January 15, 1974. It was a bitterly cold winter morning in Wichita. The streets were quiet, covered in a thin layer of frost. Inside a modest 1-story home on East 13th Street, the Otero family was beginning what should have been an ordinary day. Joseph Otero, the father, was a retired Air Force sergeant. He was strict but loving, a man who valued discipline and routine. His wife, Julie, was warm and attentive, the kind of mother who kept the house filled with laughter and the smell of home-cooked meals. Their children, 11-year-old Joseph Jr. and 9-year-old Josephine, affectionately called Josie, were bright, curious, and full of energy. The Oteros were the kind of family neighbors admired. A hard-working father, a caring mother, 2 children who played in the yard and waved to passersby. They represented everything wholesome about life in Wichita. But on this icy morning, unseen eyes were watching them. Dennis Rader had spent days stalking the Oteros. He studied their routines, noting when the children left for school, when Joseph went to work, when Julie stepped outside to check the mail. He called it projecting, selecting a target, planning every detail, and fantasizing about the control he would exert. And today, he decided the Otero family would become his first victims. Rader approached the house wearing gloves and carrying a small toolkit of terror: rope, bindings, tape. He cut the phone line first, ensuring that no frantic call for help could escape the walls. Inside, Joseph and Julie were startled as a stranger stepped through their door. Rader claimed he was a fugitive in need of food and a car. He assured them he only wanted money, that no one would be hurt if they cooperated. But it was a lie. Every word was a calculated move to gain control of the terrified family. He forced them into the living room. One by one, he bound their wrists and ankles with cord. Joseph tried to remain calm to protect his wife and children, but Rader's cold precision left no room for escape. What followed was unspeakable. Rader strangled Joseph first, cutting off the family's protector. Then he turned to Julie, binding her tighter, ignoring her pleas for mercy. The children, little Joseph Jr. and Josie, watched in horror as their parents were slowly silenced. When it was over, Rader wasn't finished. He methodically murdered the children, taking his time, reveling in the control. Before leaving, he took small items, tokens of the crime, and carefully wiped down surfaces to remove fingerprints. Hours later, family friends grew concerned when the Oteros didn't answer the door. A neighbor finally entered the house and stumbled upon a scene of pure horror. The Otero family, once full of love and laughter, now lay lifeless in their own home. The murders sent shockwaves through Wichita. People double-locked their doors, installed new deadbolts, and looked nervously at strangers in the street. Police had no motive, no suspect, and no idea that this was only the beginning. Because the killer wasn't finished. He craved attention, he wanted recognition, and soon he would make sure the world knew his name, BTK. Part 3. Letters from the Shadows. The Otero murders left Wichita frozen in fear. 4 innocent lives taken in a quiet suburban home with no clear suspect, no obvious motive, and no explanation. Newspaper headlines screamed family slain. Reporters described the crime scene as methodical and personal, but the brutality defied comprehension. Detectives scoured the house for fingerprints, traced every footprint, and questioned neighbors late into the night. Still nothing. The killer had vanished as if he were a ghost. Residents changed their daily routines. Parents no longer let children walk to school alone. Hardware stores sold out of heavy locks and window bars. Even the sound of a creaking floorboard could make hearts race. Police worked tirelessly, but behind the scenes, the man responsible was watching and savoring every moment. Dennis Rader read every headline, every article about the Otero murders. He clipped newspaper stories, carefully filing them away in a private scrapbook of terror. The fear in Wichita was his fuel. He called it adrenaline. He needed it. The power, the recognition, the knowledge that he alone controlled the city's nightmares. But Rader wasn't content to simply watch. He wanted credit. He wanted to be more than a faceless shadow. And in October 1974, 9 months after the Otero murders, he made his first move to claim the spotlight. A letter arrived at the offices of the Wichita Eagle, a local newspaper. It was addressed to a reporter and marked with a simple request: please forward to police. Inside was a chilling confession. The writer described, in precise detail, the murders of the Otero family, details that only the killer could know. He boasted about his project, explained how he had studied the family, and described the bindings he used to control his victims. Then came a line that would define him forever. He wrote, "The code word for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK, 3 simple letters, K." The moniker was born, and with it, a nightmare identity that Wichita would never forget. Detectives held the letter in stunned silence. This wasn't a killer seeking forgiveness. This was a man reveling in his crimes. He mocked investigators, bragged about his planning, and hinted that he would strike again. It wasn't a confession, it was a threat. And true to his word, BTK wasn't finished. On April 4th, 1974, just weeks after his first letter, he selected another victim, Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old college student. Catherine lived with her brother Kevin, who happened to be home when Rader broke in. Unlike the Oteros, the Bright siblings fought back. A violent struggle erupted inside the house. Rader attempted to strangle Kevin with a cord, but Kevin managed to break free, even after being shot twice. Bleeding and desperate, Kevin escaped and stumbled into the street, screaming for help. But Catherine wasn't as fortunate. Rader bound and stabbed her repeatedly before fleeing the scene. Despite emergency responders' efforts, she died later at the hospital. Kevin survived, one of the very few people ever to come face to face with BTK and live to tell the story. Police now had a living witness. But even with Kevin's description of the attacker, BTK remained a phantom. No fingerprints, no leads, no arrests. And the most terrifying part? Dennis Rader was just getting started. He had tasted control, survived near capture, and escaped into the shadows. His hunger for attention and for death was only growing. Part 4. Decades of Silence. While Wichita lived in fear of a phantom killer, Dennis Rader was blending perfectly into everyday life. By day, he was a husband, a father, a church council president, even a Cub Scout leader. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, the kind of man who'd lend you a lawnmower without asking for it back. No one suspected that behind the calm smile lived a man who meticulously planned each horrifying act of violence. To Dennis Rader, murder wasn't chaos, it was a project. And in his twisted mind, every project needed careful preparation. He kept a secret collection he called his mother lode, photos of his victims, hand-drawn sketches of bound women, even items stolen from their homes. He stored them in boxes and envelopes, revisiting them when he needed to relive the thrill. This ritual fed what he called his Factor X, an uncontrollable drive to hunt again. In March 1977, that hunger returned. Rader set his sights on Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother of 3. On a cold afternoon, he tricked his way into her house by flashing a false story, claiming he needed to use the phone. Inside, Shirley's children played in the next room. Rader calmly locked them inside a bathroom, placing toys on the floor and promising them he wouldn't hurt their mom. Then, with chilling precision, he bound and strangled Shirley Vian. When he left, he carefully removed his gloves, wiped surfaces, and disappeared once again into the Kansas streets. Weeks later, he struck again. This time, his victim was Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old woman who lived alone. Unlike Shirley's attack, Nancy's murder came with a new level of cruelty. After binding and strangling her, Rader did something that stunned detectives. He called 911 himself. The operator picked up to a calm, almost bored voice saying, "Yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing. Nancy Fox is there." Then, a quiet click. The call lasted less than 30 seconds, but it sent a chill through every officer in Wichita. The killer was taunting them, playing with them, letting them know that he was in control. Police flooded the scene. The description of the voice was vague. Male, calm, mid-30s, but the message was clear. BTK was back, and he wanted them to know it. Detectives worked frantically, cross-checking phone records, but the call had been made from a random payphone, leaving no usable trace. Once again, the phantom escaped. Rader, meanwhile, returned to his quiet suburban home. He tucked his children into bed, kissed his wife goodnight, and went back to his job as a compliance officer, issuing citations for overgrown grass and barking dogs. The contrast was almost unbearable. By day, an ordinary public servant, by night, a meticulous predator. With each killing, BTK's confidence grew. He began sending more letters to the press, mocking police failures, hinting at future attacks, and demanding that his name, Bind, Torture, Kill, be printed in bold headlines. The city lived under a constant shadow. Women double-locked their doors. Children were warned never to open to strangers. Yet detectives still had nothing concrete. No fingerprints, no DNA, no suspect. And as the 1970s turned into the 1980s, the man calling himself BTK would shock Wichita once again, not just with violence, but with a sudden, haunting silence. A silence that would last for years and hide his darkest secrets. Part 5. A Digital Mistake. After the brutal murders of Shirley Vian and Nancy Fox, Wichita braced for the next attack. But then, something strange happened. BTK vanished. No new letters. No new killings. No taunts in the mail. For a city that had been gripped by terror, the sudden silence was both a relief and a mystery. Had the killer died? Had he been arrested for another crime? Or was he simply watching, waiting, and enjoying the fear he had created? Detectives kept their task force alive, but as months turned into years, the case went cold. Evidence boxes collected dust inside Wichita Police Headquarters. New officers came and went, but the name BTK remained like a scar across the department's memory. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader was still very much alive. He had not stopped thinking about killing. But he had shifted his energy into building the perfect disguise. Rader poured himself into family life. He raised 2 children, worked steadily at his job as a city compliance officer, and earned a reputation as a stickler for the rules. He wrote up neighbors for grass that was too long, scolded residents about their pets, and proudly wore his uniform as if it gave him power. At church, he served as council president, leading prayers and organizing events. He attended Boy Scout meetings, posing for smiling group photos with young boys in uniform. To the outside world, Dennis Rader was the picture of small-town respectability. Inside, he was still BTK, collecting newspaper clippings, saving photos of his victims, and fantasizing about future murders. But for reasons only he fully understood, Rader restrained himself. For more than a decade, no new murders were linked to BTK. Detectives, facing pressure from the public, reviewed every lead, retested old evidence, and chased thousands of tips. Each ended in frustration. DNA technology was still in its infancy, and the killer's careful planning had left investigators with almost nothing. The city of Wichita tried to move on. New generations grew up with only stories of BTK, a local legend whispered by parents as a warning to stay safe. But those who had lived through the terror never forgot. Survivors and victims' families held on to grief and unanswered questions. Detectives who had worked the case carried the failure like a personal burden. Some retired with BTK still haunting their thoughts. Others kept the evidence close, quietly hoping that science or luck might one day break the silence. Then, in the early 2000s, technology finally began to catch up. DNA profiling became more advanced. Cold case units across the country were solving crimes once thought unsolvable. And in Wichita, those dusty BTK evidence boxes were reopened. New detectives, armed with new tools, began to re-examine the murders. Still, there were no fresh leads. But BTK himself, the man the world thought had disappeared, was restless. Years of hiding had fed his ego. He craved recognition. He wanted the world to remember his name. And so, after more than 25 years of silence, Dennis Rader made a decision that would become his undoing. In March 2004, a letter arrived at a Wichita newspaper. Inside was a photocopy of an old victim's driver's license and photographs from the crime scene. Details only the killer could know. BTK was back, and he was ready to play his most dangerous game yet. What investigators didn't realize was that this time, the killer's arrogance would finally give them the break they had waited for. Part 6: Confession of a Killer. By early 2004, Wichita had long since tried to bury the nightmare of BTK. Children who once stayed inside after dark were now grown adults, raising families of their own. Many believed the killer was dead. Others feared he was still out there watching. Then, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle newspaper. Inside were photocopied crime scene photos and a victim's driver's license, items stolen from a murder scene that only BTK could possess. The letter was signed BTK. Detectives couldn't believe it. After more than a decade of silence and nearly 30 years since his first kill, the ghost of BTK had returned. Over the next few months, more letters followed. Packages were left in public places, including a cereal box in the bed of a pickup truck and another box hidden in a Home Depot parking lot. Each delivery contained puzzles, cryptic messages, and references to old crimes. Rader seemed to be testing the police, taunting them, and demanding recognition. But what he didn't realize was that technology had finally caught up with him. Detectives carefully collected every piece of evidence: fingerprints, fibers, and most importantly, digital clues. In one letter, BTK asked police an unusual question. If he sent them a computer disk, could they trace it back to him? He wanted reassurance, and astonishingly, detectives answered publicly through the newspaper. They claimed the disk would be safe. It was a calculated trap. Rader fell for it. He mailed a purple 3.5-inch floppy disk to a local TV station. Investigators immediately sent the disk to their lab. Within hours, digital forensics revealed the metadata. The file had been last modified by a user named Dennis. The disk was linked to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas, and church records showed that the president of the council was a man named Dennis Rader. Detectives finally had a name, but they needed hard proof. Using a covert plan, police obtained a DNA sample from a medical record belonging to Rader's daughter. When the lab compared it to the DNA found under victim Vicky Wegerle's fingernails, it was a perfect match. After nearly 30 years, the BTK Killer had been unmasked. On February 25, 2005, police surrounded Dennis Rader as he drove near his home. He surrendered quietly, almost politely, as if he had been expecting them. Inside the interrogation room, detectives finally confronted the man who had haunted Wichita for decades. At first, Rader denied everything, but as the evidence mounted, his facade crumbled. Hours later, he began to speak. For more than 30 hours, Dennis Rader calmly described his murders in chilling detail, how he stalked his victims, tied them up, and savored their terror. He spoke with no remorse, sometimes even correcting detectives on small details like a man proud of his work. In court, Rader stunned the world by pleading guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. He gave a cold, matter-of-fact account of each killing, often pausing to describe the knots he tied and the fantasies that drove him. Victims' families wept in the courtroom. The judge listened in silence as BTK turned their private grief into his final performance. When the sentence was handed down, 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, Rader showed almost no emotion. The monster who once demanded attention was now condemned to spend the rest of his life in a small cell, his voice silenced at last. For Wichita, the arrest brought both relief and haunting questions. How had this church-going father lived undetected for so long? How many times had neighbors shaken his hand, never knowing they were touching pure evil? Even today, Dennis Rader sits in a Kansas prison, writing letters and occasionally speaking with investigators about unsolved cases. His name remains a warning, a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary face. And it makes you wonder, how many other ordinary people around us might be living double lives? If you found this case chilling, don't forget to subscribe because we have even darker stories to uncover. Stay with us. You won't believe what's coming next.